Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm glad to be here. For a period of time, we had Tyson Foods had a joint venture here in Santa Rosa with the Carnes Pampianas. So I have a little bit of an understanding as to how your business operates. And I think it's fair to say that at this moment you're somewhat at a crossroads when it comes to what your future is going to be. Traditionally, you've been concentrating either on the European business, the value-added business in Europe, or on the commodity business, which might have been in the Middle East, which might have been in Russia. But there's a great opportunity, I believe, for Argentina as it relates to doing value-added business, and that business is primarily in the growing areas of the Asian continent. Not only Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, but certainly the biggest player of them all is China. And China ultimately will require a very similar product that's being consumed particularly in Japan and Korea. So I think the meeting objective here is to find what the global competition does and what, if any, you can learn from it. That's the way I see it. Does it have applications to the Argentine business, either both domestically or internationally? I think that's ultimately something that the Argentine industry has to decide for itself. From my perspective, I think I want to share with you several things. First of all, I want to share with you how the US industry got to where it is today. Secondly, I want to share with you how we started our international business. So let's first talk a little bit about the development or the shaping of the US industry. In the 60s and early 70s, this became a major change for the industry at large. First of all, we started building plants at the source of cattle supply. So historically, we had a lot of plants located in what I call the greater metropolitan areas, Chicago, New York. That all started to change. And the logic was, why would we transport live cattle in rail cars and trucks to the big cities if we can process these cattle at the source of supply? First of all, it would be much more advantageous from a yield perspective. Cattle didn't have that stress to go out there, but also we could do that cheaper in the countryside versus working in a major city. The second thing that started to build this business is we moved from carcass beef to boxed beef. My old company, starting with IBP and later Tyson Foods, was a major innovator at that time. We were an unknown player. Most of the business was in the hands of Swift, Armour, Cudahy, that type of people. So we kind of were a newcomer. And the founders of the company had the foresight to say that we can do this differently. We can make this more efficiently. So over time, after we built these plants at the source of supply, we moved into what I call cattle pack business. Instead of shipping carcasses, we were shipping chucks, ribs, loin, and round primals. We called it cattle pack. You buy the equivalent of a head in boxes rather than on swinging beef. As time went on, most of these retailers said, listen, you know, we want to buy X amount of cattle in cattle pack form, carcass equivalent, but we also could use extra chucks or extra loins or extra rounds. So at that time we converted and became cattle pack plus supplemental cuts. As time went on, we forgot about the whole cattle pack business. We started individual cuts because different retailers have a different product mix. So as time progressed, it was in individual cuts only. From individual cuts, we went to user-friendly. We went to muscle boning. And as part of this whole structure, in our export business, we learned a lot. As a matter of fact, during my time in Argentina, I learned a lot here as well. For instance, in the Far East, we had people that were requesting us to sell what I call the marucha. And that was primarily in Taiwan. Today, the marucha steaks, or what we call flat iron steaks, is one of the premier items that you have for lunch or for dinner. It's a very tender muscle. We never discovered it until somebody else pointed it out to us. There's other examples. We went to what we call a two-piece chuck, something that you do in Argentina or in South America as well, the Huacho Lomo and the Sobre Costilla. These are items that now become very much popular as well, especially when we go to case-ready beef. The other example is the two-piece sirloin. So then you're talking about the picanha, and you're talking about the center-cut sirloin. Those are some of the examples. When we started working in the Far East with Taiwan and Hong Kong, we came out to produce an item called bananita, which comes out of the tortuguita mussel. So these are all examples of value-added products that we learned through international markets, and some of those we are now using in the United States market as well. As a matter of fact, today we have no maruchas available for the international marketplace. The domestic US market has taken them all. As time went on, we went into value-added cuts for retail and food service. And today, we have case-ready plants. My old company has 4 case-ready plants, 3 beef and pork, and we also have ground beef plants. Because that changes as well. When you take advantage of the economies of scale, and you move plants to the source of supply, that also has different changes. You can no longer depend on just harvesting cattle, processing cattle, fabricating cattle. But when you have these big numbers like 4,000 or 5,000 head a day, you also need to have a fully integrated operational system. With that I mean rendered products, hides. Today also our hide business, we have 4, in our company we have 4 wet blue plants. We have pet food plants, we have a pharmaceutical group, and also when you start making boxed beef, you will get a tremendous amount of trim, especially when you have grain-fed cattle. In Argentina, basically you have an 80-20. In the States, we have trimmings from anywhere 93, 80, 73, 50, and we go to sparse lean, which is 37%. The majority of all trimmings above 50% lean are basically grind. So we are grinding our own ground beef. As time went on, we were producing that in what I call retail bags. Today, we're actually making what we call a case-ready ground beef. So it's ground just the way the butcher would do it, but it's in a case-ready form. And the main reason for going to further into case-ready beef, or for that matter pork, is because, especially on the beef side, food safety perspective. Shop trim has a big risk. When packers on their own, or butcher shops on their own, or retailers on their own start grinding trimmings, there's a very good chance that you will have E. coli problems. So this whole process also is part of what I would call consumer protection, or to meet safety concerns. When we started this whole revolution in the 70s, and as time went on, we also did a lot of things different with cattle procurement. Direct purchasing instead of buying through auctions or brokers. We also developed ultimately what we call a performance-based cattle price. So in other words, you can sell us cattle on the hoof, which means we buy the live animal, no questions asked, no nothing. But you can also sell us cattle in the meat. That means we pay you after we have the grade. Now, in all countries, and Argentina is no different, if you're a livestock producer and you deal with the packer, from time to time you can't agree on price. So when, as a livestock producer, you have 10,000 head to sell this week, and guess what? Nobody wants to buy them because they think they're too expensive. Next week you have 20,000 and 10,000 to sell. So we find a solution for that because we had the same problem. And basically, it's what I call, we went from cash to a grid system. Basically, the grid system is based on USDA base price and based on the quality that that animal ultimately brings once we have graded it. We have a grid, so we don't have to argue about price, we only have to argue about volume. And typically, volume and grid-based marketing goes hand in hand. Many changes over the years, especially in the 70s, after there was problems, the late 70s, we have to pay the livestock producers within 48 hours. And typically, I know in Argentina that's not the case, nor do the packers get paid within 48 hours. They might have to wait 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days in order to get paid. It's a little bit different in the States. I think we have a much more stricter payment system, but it's something that also I need to point out in this whole story, because ultimately, you know, that makes you more efficient and it makes you more economical on how you run your business. We grade carcasses after 24 hours. The first 24 hours we're in a hot box or a cooler. And this gives us the chance to also remove the body heat out of the animal much faster. Then we will have the grading after 24 hours. And typically we leave those carcasses in what we call a regular cooler for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, depends on the plant, depends on the production. So ultimately, really, we also need to have consistency of carcasses. We need to have uniformity in the US grading system, especially when you operate multiple plants. You know, when we have at one time, currently, given the Tyson example, we have 6 what we call complex plants. That means we harvest cattle and we fabricate cattle at that particular location. We can't have inconsistencies, because our customers expect us to deliver the same choice meat out of Amarillo, Texas, as we do out of all these other 5 plants. So once you get to that, if you ever decide to go to a certain system, then you need to make sure that you compare apples to apples with your competition, especially when you do your exports, because that's very important that you have a very consistent product for that market. As was said in the presentation from Nelson, today's technology is helping. We have, of course, camera grading, and that's made a world of difference. There is less arguments between government and packer. It's easy to see what works and what doesn't work. So instead of railing these carcasses off and having a big debate over 50 head of cattle at the end of the day, now we might only have to argue about 1 head. So now let me talk a little bit about the development of the US export business. When I joined the IBP company in the late 70s, 78, early 78, the only business that the US did, and our company as well, was to export offals to Europe. As time went on, about several years later, Europe started talking about the third country meat directive. They also started talking about a ban on hormone cattle. At the same time, we started to see interest from the Far East, and that started all in Japan. Gradually, Japan became a major buyer of the beef tongue. That was the first item they bought. So that helped us because the majority of the beef tongues went to Europe. So we started converting plants from European tongues to Japanese tongues, which was a different specification. As time went on, we were out of the European market. We were able to convert products, more products, to Asia. But we were also able to grow the total product mix because Europe didn't buy products that Asia wanted. A couple of examples are Achilles tendons, weazened meat, large and small intestines, hanging tenders outside skirts, which had no value in the United States at that time, until the fajitas came from the Mexican market. So we used to sell hanging tenders and outside skirts at $3.50 to $4 a pound, whereas domestically they would ended up in ground beef at 60 cents a pound. So I think this is important to note, not only for offals, but as to how our boxed beef business developed over the years. When you go to what I call the new developing markets in the Far East, there is a tremendous amount of value-added opportunity for everybody that's involved in the business. Whether that's Argentina under the current classification system, or whether it will be when you might create a different system. We talked a little bit earlier on there was conversation that, what I think you call that Mesa de la Carne. Of course, the USMEF organization is a very similar organization. We have a very unique membership that starts with the farmers who produce the grains that we need for our feed ingredients. We have livestock producers. We have packers, exporters. We have pharmaceutical companies and a few more. So it's a very unique approach, and I think you have the same thing. But when you work with a variety of people, it's not always easy to get a consensus, because honestly speaking, there's certain times of the month that packers really appreciate everything that the livestock producers do for you. And there's times that we don't, and that's vice versa. I call that a hate-love relationship. But ultimately, whether it's domestic or international, I think it only is important for everybody to work together, to have a united approach, not only to your domestic business, but especially to your international business. The united approach is important when you have to work with your own government, and if you have 5 different stakeholders and you have 5 different opinions when you talk to the Secretary of Agriculture, it's not going to work. Then they're going to make their own decisions. So if you have a united front, that will enhance the way you're able to conduct business and how you get market access. At the same time, I must say, packers are in the margin business. But at the same time, we cannot have poor livestock producers or poor customers. We need to strive towards having a healthy industry that everybody can share in what I call that total contribution or value-added contribution, so that all stakeholders of the Mesa de la Carne have an opportunity to enhance their business. Actually, when you look at Argentina and the United States, we're in a way very comparable. Argentina exports 16% of its total beef production. In the United States, I think right now we're at 14%. Obviously, that might vary from primal to primal. Your rump and loin is probably 50, 60, or 70% or more, whereas some of the other cuts, you might export 0. And that can change, because Europe is not Asia. Europe primarily wants rump and loin, whereas the Asian market is very interested in what I call specifically the 4-quarter cuts. I'll give you some examples. From that 14% in the United States, when we look at just the 4-quarter, we're looking at the short ribs, the asados, and we're looking at short plates. This business goes 100% to Asia, whether it's Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, China, or Taiwan. Today, we don't have enough demand to keep up. I don't know what the recent prices for short plates were, but I'll give you an example. At one time, they were $3 a pound. If we don't produce short plates in the United States, they're going to end up in 50-50 trim, because that's the approximate chemical lean percentage. 4 years ago, Hong Kong closed its borders because China was not taking any meat. We went from $3 a pound on short plates to having to put back in 50 trim. Before that, we had to do that. 50 trim was worth 80 cents a pound. After we put it in trim, it was worth 27 cents a pound. So this is the impact that export markets can have, but at the same time, it also demonstrates what value-added opportunities you have. Asados. We make basically a bone-in short rib, a 123A, and we make rib short ribs, and we make boneless chuck short ribs. These prices today, bone-in into Korea, are around $5 a pound. So you can imagine if you would have to sell that in the United States market, it would be under $1 a pound. These are actually these are interesting things for Argentina to know as well, because if you ever want to get full advantage, to take full advantage of these export markets, you will have to make some decisions. Are you going to sell your traditional asada, what I call rack, in Argentina, Or are you going to take advantage of producing the short plates, which contain some of these ribs, the short plate, the short ribs, and the chuck ribs? So those are opportunities, but they also will mean that you have to change your business domestically as well. And that's something you have to work out on your own. We had to do the same thing. Ultimately, we all export in order to create value-added business for ourselves. When it comes to the Asian market versus what I call the European market, most importantly for export, I believe, you must produce to excellence, not to minimum standards or specifications that get you by. And I can say that now because I'm retired. I'll give you an example. What you sell in grain-fed beef to Europe right now, you are meeting minimum specifications, but you're really not matching Australian or US standards of high-quality beef. Now that's a political issue. Hopefully one of these days it gets resolved. But it is something that I wanted to mention because you can get by with that in Asia. In Japan, a lot of people here have been to Japan. You have to be perfect. You have to be better than perfect. If you're not perfect, don't bother. Then you go to China, they're more forgiving. But in Japan, they will pay you more. Yeah? So you have to keep that in mind. Consistency, I mentioned that earlier, is key as well. It's the same for boxed beef like it is for offals. You have a huge advantage here in Argentina. You have probably, you have the best herd in the world. You have 60-70% Angus or Hereford cattle. There's very little crossbred, and that gives you an outstanding quality. You have high quality grass, the lush grass of the pampas, to basically raise these calves. You can do backgrounding there as well. And then if you ever decide to go into high quality beef and you are gonna go feed these cattle, do it right, and you will have a superior product. I know that. We tried it at Carnes Pampeanas. It didn't necessarily work because many people in the world, especially in Europe, when you talk to them about Argentine beef, it's grass-fed beef. They don't want a quarter inch or a half inch of fat on it or have lots of marbling. So these are some of the things you need to think through. But it definitely is an opportunity in the Far East because they want marbling and they are prepared to pay for that. Also, I think feeding cattle, certainly in the United States, but I think probably even more important for the Argentine industry, you don't need to think 4 or 5 years out, because although our A-grade cattle could be up to, 4 years, technically, I can tell you that most grain-fed cattle in the United States, certainly what the major packers do, are anywhere from 18 to 24 years old. So in order to get there, obviously you need to have a good cow-calf background. You need to have good backgrounding if necessary. And if you put them on feed, then you will reduce that life cycle that you need to look at today. Now you have to look in Argentina, you look at 4 or 5 years to get good grass-fed cattle. You can reduce that. Since your economy has some issues, although improving, I think that's one way to manage your business as you go forward. A couple other things I want to talk about, and really, then I'm going to stop because I think there might be more questions than the answers we have. So, but then we'll probably open it up. How does market access work in the U.S. to foreign countries? I said that earlier a little bit. We work with USMEF. We work with livestock producers. But ultimately, the government does all the negotiations with those countries. When you start working in Japan, we had some specific challenges. First of all, bilingual labels, specifications, packaging. Needless to say, our business changed greatly. In general, though, I think when you look at it from a domestic perspective in the United States, business has changed because we need to decide how we're going to deal with the demands of the millennium people. I think to a certain extent that's also true in Asia. But in Asia, it's much more important that we have to determine and meet the expectations of different cultures and different consumer expectations when it comes to cuts. That's especially true in those developing markets, but also in those long-term existing markets like Japan. So with that, I conclude my conversation on my notes here, and I think we're probably going to open it up for questions. Yeah. Thank you.